The doctor arrived with his coat still wet from the February sleet, a kerosene lamp swinging from his left hand, because the tenant cabin outside Chillicothe had no light of its own worth the name. Ezra Whitcomb was 53 years old that night in 1887, and in the small leather daybook he carried in his coat pocket he had recorded the deaths of 461 people in Ross County, Ohio across 19 years of practice. He expected this one to be the 462nd. The woman on the corn husk mattress was registered in the county ledger only as Mary, colored, approximately 94 years of age, without surname, without recorded birthplace, without next of kin. She was not dying of anything he could treat. She was dying of time. What happened in the next 3 hours is preserved in 14 pages of his private daybook in handwriting that begins steady and becomes by the final pages the handwriting of a man who is no longer certain what he is writing down. She refused to speak until he agreed in ink at the top of the first page to transcribe exactly what she said, not what he thought she meant, not what he thought a reasonable woman might have meant. What she said, he wrote the sentence. He signed it. He held the page up so she could see the signature, though he had been told she could not read. She nodded once. Then she gave him her first line, and he copied it without alteration. The ones they say never were. I was raised by them until I was 9. The 14 pages that follow describe people she called the Old Keepers. She said they were 7 and 8 feet in height. She said they lived in stone-lined chambers inside the earth mounds that rose out of the Hawking Valley when she was a child before the statehood surveys came through. She described flat stone floors. She described timbered ceilings. She described raised platforms where the dead were placed with their knees drawn up. She gave Whitcomb a name for these people in a language he did not recognize and could not spell, and he wrote it phonetically in the margin of page 9, where it still sits in the only surviving copy of the notebook, a carbon transcription made in 1923 and now held in a private collection in Toledo. The original notebook was cataloged in the Ross County Historical Society in 1894. It appears in the inventory ledgers of 1891, 1898, 1934, and 1947. It does not appear in the inventory ledger of 1953. Between those two dates, in 1952, the Bureau of American Ethnology Successor Office at the Smithsonian reclassified its 19th century mound survey correspondence. The two events are separated by roughly 11 months and 1,000 miles. That is the kind of coincidence that once noticed becomes difficult to unnotice. This is where the story begins to stop being about an old woman in a cabin. The accepted version of the American mound builder question is short, clean, and has not meaningfully changed in 130 years. The Adena and Hopewell peoples, ancestors of historically documented indigenous nations, constructed earth mounds across the Ohio Valley and the Mississippi drainage for ceremonial and mortuary purposes. The builders were of ordinary stature. Nothing anomalous was ever recovered. The question is settled. The document that settles it is the 12th annual report of the Bureau of American Ethnology, published in 1894 under the direction of Cyrus Thomas, and it is cited in one form or another in every introductory American archaeology textbook printed since. It is the closing door of the 19th century mound question. It was written, as we shall see, to end a question, not to answer one. Between 1829 and 1891, more than 200 regional American newspapers carried first-person accounts of skeletons recovered from mounds in Ohio, West Virginia, Kentucky, Tennessee, and Wisconsin, measured at 7 to 9 feet in length. The accounts were filed by county coroners, surveying engineers, canal foremen, Methodist ministers, and in several instances by the excavators themselves. The Miamisburg Mound opening of 1869. The Dr. Everhart dig outside Zanesville in 1872. The Conjort excavations in the Western Reserve. The Creel Mound in South Charleston, West Virginia, opened under Smithsonian supervision in 1883 and 1884, with the fieldwork conducted by P.W. Norris under direct assignment from Thomas's own bureau. The Crile field notes preserved in the Smithsonian archives record a central skeleton measuring 7 feet 6 inches, laid out beneath a layer of bark and timber in a stone-lined vault. The 1894 report, which incorporated the Crile excavation into its findings, describes the same burial as containing remains of unusual length without numerical measurement. This is the first fracture, and it is not where a reasonable person might expect it. The fracture is not that the skeletons existed. The fracture is the editorial distance between the field notes and the published report. Field notes recorded femurs in inches. The published volume, issued 7 years later, converted those inches into vague descriptors or dropped the measurements altogether or reassigned the anomalous remains to unnumbered appendices that did not survive the editorial process. The raw record and the clean record do not match. The clean record is the one the textbooks cite. That is the moment the story stops being about whether giants existed in the American interior and starts being about who edited the record and when and under whose authority. Those are different questions. They lead to different places. Return now to the cabin in February 1887. Mary was born by her own reckoning, and by the rough calculation Whitcomb performed at her bedside around 1793. She was sold south at the age of 9 in the summer of 1820, which is the same summer the Ohio State Surveys began cutting township lines through the Hawking Valley. She described the settlement she was taken from as a place where the old keepers lived in the mounds and the younger people lived in cabins around them, and she described the chambers inside the mounds in architectural detail that matches almost exactly the interior configuration of the Grave Creek Mound in present-day West Virginia as it was first opened in 1838. She was illiterate. She had been held in bondage in Alabama for 70 of the intervening years. She could not have read the Grave Creek Report. The Grave Creek Report had not been written until she was 45 years old and 900 miles away, working in a cotton field under a different name. The coincidence is not a coincidence. It is corroboration. Between 1830 and 1850, the mounds of the Ohio, Canner, and Coyote valleys were opened at a rate that has no parallel in any other archaeological effort of the period. The openings were not conducted by trained antiquarians. They were conducted by canal contractors, railroad surveyors, and farmers clearing land under the land ordinances of the young republic. The Mound Relic Committee of the American Ethnological Society, formed in New York in 1845, corresponded privately with officers of the War Department regarding what it called, in a letter dated March of that year, items of uncommon dimension recovered during the cutting of the Chesapeake and Ohio Canal Works. The letter does not describe the items. The letter requests instructions regarding their disposition. The mounds of the interior were not studied in the 1830s and 1840s. They were emptied. The emptying preceded by a full generation the institutional framework built to explain what had been inside them. Every museum cabinet in the eastern United States that today bears the label Adena Culture is describing in good faith a remnant collection. The report that bound those remnants into a coherent narrative was written 50 years after the original material had been removed, sorted, redistributed, or lost. The Smithsonian Institution was chartered by Act of Congress in 1846. The Bureau of American Ethnology was established within it in 1879. Between those two dates and through the decades that followed, federal policy toward indigenous land, indigenous identity, and indigenous antiquity was consolidated under a single institutional authority for the first time in American history. Now placed 3 dates on a single line: the Indian Removal Act of 1830, the General Allotment Act signed into law on the 8th of February, 1887, the Antiquities Act of 1916. The first removed the living. The third claimed the ruins. The one in the middle is the one Mary died beneath. She died in a cabin outside Chillicothe in February 1887. In the same week, Congress passed the law that would reassign every acre of collectively held indigenous land in the United States to individual allotment and white surplus. The bureaucratic machinery of that reassignment required a settled prehistory. It required a mound builder question that was no longer a question. It required the people in the urn chambers to be definitively the ancestors of the people whose land was being allotted, because, if they were not, the legal geometry of the allotment broke. If the mounds had been built by anyone else, by anyone older, by anyone larger, the law lost its floor. The question that closes this first half of the story is simple, and it is the one Whitcomb himself wrote at the bottom of page 14 of his daybook in handwriting, by then barely legible. If the people in those mounds did not fit the categories the Republic was building its land policy around, what happened to the evidence of them? And what happened to the descendants like Mary, who remembered them? He did not answer the question that night. He did something else. In March of 1887, 3 weeks after she was buried, Ezra Whitcomb made a second copy of the 14 pages of her testimony, sealed it in an envelope, and sent it by registered mail to an address in Washington, D.C. The envelope was logged on arrival. The recipient's name is still legible in the receiving index. It is not a name anyone reading this would expect. The recipient was John Wesley Powell. He is not an obscure figure. He is the one-armed Civil War veteran who descended the Colorado River in 1869, the explorer whose name is carved into the canyon systems of the American West, the founder and first director of the Bureau of American Ethnology, and the man who in 1881 had assigned Cyrus Thomas the task of producing the 12th annual report that would close the mound question for a century. He was also in March of 1887 the most powerful single authority on indigenous American prehistory in the United States government. The envelope from Chillicothe arrived in his office and was logged into the Bureau's correspondence index under folio 114. The outer sleeve survives in the Smithsonian archives. The contents do not. The sleeve bears a red stamp that reads Ret, which in the clerical conventions of that office could mean either returned to sender or retained in director's private file, depending on the hand that made the mark. No record indicates which applied in this case. Whitcomb, for his part, never received any reply and died 4 years later in Chillicothe without having mentioned the exchange to anyone who left a written record of it. Something, however, happened in the public posture of John Wesley Powell in the months that followed. His statements on the mound question, which had previously allowed for a measured uncertainty, a willingness to concede unresolved details, grew noticeably firmer from late 1887 onward. The builders were unremarkable. The measurements in the popular press were exaggerated. The oral traditions of the region's remaining indigenous communities were unreliable and contaminated by contact with white folklore. The question was closed. The question had always been closed. The question would remain closed. Something arrived at his desk in March of 1887, and something hardened in his public voice after it. The temptation at this point in the story is to frame what followed as suppression in the theatrical sense as a conspiracy of silence. That framing is emotionally satisfying and structurally wrong. What followed was not suppression. It was editorial consolidation carried out across a 40-year institutional project by men who believed, not without reason, that they were building a modern and rational American science out of the chaotic regional amateurism of the century they had inherited. The Thomas Report was not neutral scholarship. It was a legal instrument. If the earthen mounds of the interior had been built by an unknown non-indigenous or pre-indigenous population, then the ancestral land claims of the documented tribes of the 19th century weakened because the mounds and the lands they stood on would no longer represent continuous indigenous occupation. But the settler claim to the same ground already articulated as the settling of a developmentally vacant continent also weakened because the continent would have been inhabited by a people whose achievements complicated every inherited category the Republic had used to justify its westward motion. The resolution the Bureau chose was the narrowest possible. The mounds were built by the ancestors of the historically documented tribes. They were ordinary in scale and function. There was no earlier population. There were no anomalous remains. There was no continuing mystery. This resolution served land policy, racial taxonomy, and institutional authority at once. And that is not a coincidence of convenience. The people who benefited from the designed outcome were not a small group, and they were not hidden. Railroad surveyors whose routes crossed Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, and Kentucky needed clean title through mound country and needed no complicating narratives about the ground beneath their grade stakes. Land-grant colleges chartered under the Morrill Act of 1862 and expanded through the 1880s needed a settled prehistory. They could teach in survey courses without professional embarrassment. Eastern museums competing for federal legitimacy in the generation after the Civil War needed cataloged collections rather than open questions. Treasury officials calculating the fiscal mechanics of the Doors Act in 1887 needed a bounded and legible indigenous past in order to allot a bounded and legible indigenous future. The mound record had to be closed because the land record had to be closed. Those are the same sentence written twice. The pattern does not stop at the Ohio Valley. It repeats at Lovelock Cave in Nevada between 1911 and 1912. A guano mining operation recovered what the local press described as skeletal remains of extraordinary length, along with red-haired mummified material that was briefly on display at the nearby Humboldt Museum before being transferred stages to institutional custody in Berkeley and Washington. The field accounts specify measurements. The published accounts do not. At the Ittawar complex in Georgia, excavations carried out under Smithsonian authority in the 1880s produced field notes describing several burials in the central mound whose dimensions did not reach the published summary reports. On Catalina Island off the California coast, the de Rougemont excavations carried out intermittently between 1919 and 1928 produced, according to the field diaries of Ralph Glidden, skeletal material of unusual proportion that was crated, shipped, and never again publicly inventoried. The three-stage sequence is always the same. The local or regional press records the find in specific, measurable detail. A federal or federally adjacent institution takes custody of the material. The published account, when it finally appears, softens the measurements, abstracts the description, or omits the find entirely. The appearance is American archaeology coming of age, professionalizing itself, discarding the sensational journalism of an earlier century in favor of disciplined, measured, responsible science. That is the appearance, and there is a genuine version of it that did occur and that produced real knowledge. The function underneath the appearance was different. The function was the conversion of a continent's unresolved prehistory into a closed, manageable, nationally useful chapter compatible with the land, race, and property frameworks the Republic was then building. The mound builders were not written out because they were fantastical. They were written out because their existence at the scale and form the field evidence repeatedly suggested did not fit the schema the Republic needed its past to have. Now return to the cabin. Mary died in February 1887. The Doors Act was signed on the 8th of that same month. Whitcomb's letter reached Powell in March. The Bureau's public tone sharpened by late autumn. She was buried in an unmarked plot behind the Methodist Cemetery on the southern edge of Chillicothe in ground that was at the time of her burial still owned by the church in trust for the indigent dead. The plot is to this day unmarked. No headstone has ever been placed. The cemetery records preserve only the line that was written in the county ledger. Mary, colored, approximately 94 years of age, without surname, except that she did give Whitcomb a name that night, and he wrote it down. It sits on page 9 of the carbon transcription in the margin in his handwriting, rendered phonetically, because she was speaking a language he did not recognize and could not assign to any family of the American interior. 3 20th-century linguists have examined the marginal notation across the decades since the carbon surfaced in Toledo. None of them have been able to place it. What they have been able to confirm is what it is not. It is not Algonquian. It is not Iroquoian. It is not Siouan. It is not Muskogean. It is not any Creole of the coastal or interior southeast that any of them recognize. She was in the winter of 1887. The last person alive in the United States who remembered from the inside being raised by the people. The Bureau was at that same moment formally declaring they had never existed. The notebook was not lost. That is the final quiet thing to be said about the notebook. It was inventoried in the Ross County Historical Society continuously from 1894 until 1947. It was not inventoried in 1953. The inventory cards for the intervening 5 years, which should exist as standard accession procedure, do not exist. In 1952, the Smithsonian reclassified its 19th century mound survey correspondence. And in the course of that reclassification, an internal request was issued from Washington to regional historical societies across the Ohio Valley for the loan or transfer of private field materials bearing on the mound question. The request is preserved in Smithsonian correspondence files. The list of societies that responded is not, that is the cleanest way to put it. The notebook was not lost. It was removed. What was called science in the generation after the Civil War was in part a sorting operation. What was called archaeological discovery was in part an archaeological closure. What was framed for a century as the mound builder question was never strictly speaking a question about the mounds. It was a question about what a country was willing to be descended from and what it was willing to bury in order to be descended from something else. The ending is the beginning recovered with its meaning restored. A doctor with a wet coat and a kerosene lamp sits at the bedside of a woman who has no surname in any register. She makes him promise in ink to transcribe what she says and not what he thinks she means. She tells him she was raised by people the country has decided did not exist. He believes her because the 14 pages he writes that night are not the pages of a man indulging a dying woman. They are the pages of a man who has understood slowly and against his own training that he is being told the truth. He sends a copy to Washington because he does not know what else to do with it. It arrives. It is logged. It vanishes. And somewhere in a federal storage facility in a folio labeled 1887, an empty paper sleeve still carries the postmark of the day her name arrived in that city. The name itself is on page 9 of a carbon copy in a private collection in Toledo, written in the margin in the handwriting of a country doctor who did not know what language he was spelling. The people she named are in the cabinets of a dozen museums under a label she would not have recognized. The land they built on is held by deeds issued after they were declared not to have existed. That is what the official story was. Cảm ơn lắng nghe. Comment, like, subscribe nếu thấy hữu ích hãy góp ý cho chúng tôi.